Newsmaker Sunday with Fox 10's John Hook.
Thanks for joining us on Newsmaker Sunday. We're going to talk about what's happening with tariffs. What are tariffs? They're basically a tax on goods. And we are in the middle of a battle right now with a lot of our allies and China over how much is imposed in taxes or tariffs on goods coming into the U.S. and goods going the other direction. And joining us today to talk about it is Dale Rogers. He is an ASU professor of logistics and supply chain management. He's been at this a long time. He understands this issue, and we're going to break it down for you so you know what's at stake. Thanks for being here.
Nice to be with you.
What's the biggest misconception when we start talking about tariffs? When people hear that word, I mean, it's basically a tax going both ways. What's happening right now in the world and what's about to happen?
Well, you know, we've been in a really interesting period where many countries, the most successful, the most developed countries, have really reduced the amount of tariffs. I mean, if you think about, for instance, Europe before 1992 and the development of the EU, there used to be tariffs and taxes between all those countries. And Europe has really thrived since they got rid of most of those. The U.S., we've always been rather open for the last 70 years. Prior to that, we would sort of veer between lots of tariffs and less tariffs and
you're talking about taxes basically on goods coming into the U.S.
Well, I mean, it's what the Revolutionary War was
exactly
really fought about. And look at the Chinese economy in the last 15, 20 years. What's the difference? Well, they've opened up. It's still a hard place to just plop stuff in there because of, you know, the demands of we want to see the intellectual property and so on. But the opening up of China has dramatically changed the lives of the Chinese people.
And it's been good for U.S. companies, right? Take
Absolutely.
Apple, for example. Apple is thriving selling iPhones in China. I
Right.
think they
Most
sell
valuable
more of them
company
now.
in the world.
Right? They sell more iPhones now in China than here?
And if you think about Apple, I think probably a lot of people have seen the Steve Jobs movies and so on. If you think about Apple when they almost went out of business in the mid-90s, they weren't managing their capital very well. And one of the things that investors look for, Wall Street, is a reduction of assets. So if you look at something that has been sort of subtle, I think, for a lot of people, it's been shedding of assets, because when you look at the key investment metrics, return on asset, return on investment,
you don't want the asset to be too high, because then the return isn't as good.
Right. And so Apple has been very successful at building this global supply chain that has resulted in them being the most valuable company in the world.
The glass comes from here.
Glass comes from the U.S.
Components come from South Korea.
All over, some China. The largest, the highest value content comes from South Korea, and then it's assembled in China.
Okay.
But you know, you can look 5 or 6 or 10 years in the future and figure, I wonder if the assembly of the iPhone will really move to a lower labor cost place like Vietnam. Let me just tell you a quick story about that just for a second. So think about the shoe business, sneakers, in the late 60s, early 70s. Nike starts up. They didn't have the capital to invest in their own factories like Adidas had. Converse was in the U.S., New Balance.
They outsourced.
Puma. They build an outsourcing model. How did they do that? Well, where they started was making shoes in Japan. Would anybody in 2018 put a shoe factory in Japan? No.
Isn't it typical that as economies grow, as nation states start to really get their economy humming, and if, like China used to make a lot of stuff, now it's Cambodia, it's Vietnam,
right?
India, even though India's got a great economy.
Indonesia.
They move it to the burgeoning, the ones that are starting to move up the chain, right?
Or you move it to Eastern China. So the Western China, and South particularly, is too expensive these days to put many factories in. So there still is, they kind of still are in the frontier days in China. So you can go to Eastern China, and while the infrastructure isn't great yet, they're investing in infrastructure like crazy. And in fact, they have a really interesting plan, because they can see a day when their products they manufacture there are going to be too expensive. They have an initiative called the One Belt, One Road, which is sort of the recreation of the ancient Silk Road. It's really fascinating what they're doing, and they're going to be connected with all these various countries who are probably lower labor costs.
Right.
Pakistan would be one of them, Iraq.
This is just a typical way it goes. So the United States, the fact that people say, well, we don't make anything anymore, this is kind of typical of an economy that's really jumped. And then you move the manufacturing somewhere else. So is it folly when the president says, we need stuff made here in the USA? Is that just not practical in this day and age?
Well,
because of labor costs.
To me, it shows a lack of understanding of how supply chains work. But it sounds good to a lot of folks who remember the old days. I grew up in Lansing, Michigan, and worked for Oldsmobile when I was a young adult. And most of the kids I went to high school with chose to not go to college, but go directly to work in the shop, we called it. And it could be a great life. You could make, in 1975, you could make, with overtime, $30,000 a year, and you could have new cars, because the cost of buying a car, if you're an Oldsmobile employee, was very low, and you could have a cottage up north and a nice house somewhere in Lansing. And those days are over. 1980, 100,000 automobile workers related to the auto industry, not just all Oldsmobile or Fisher Body, but other suppliers and so on, in Lansing, Michigan, 100,000. Today, less than 3,000.
This is just the way of the world.
Right.
Let me play for you. This is President Trump on talking about how the U.S. is being treated unfairly in our trade agreements. Take a look.
We are not going to live with the deals the way they are. European Union treats us very unfairly. Canada, very unfairly. Mexico, very unfairly. With that being said, I think we'll probably very easily make a deal.
So he's saying everybody, everybody's screwing the United States, and we need to level the playing field. First of all, it's a simple question, and he mentioned it, I think, at the EU. Why not get rid of all the tariffs? Just level the playing field completely. Why could that not be done?
I actually think that's a great idea.
Just get rid of them.
Yeah, that would work so well for us. That would be great.
Would it be great for the EU?
Well, the problem would be, long run, I think it would be great. Short run, for a lot of economies, particularly economies with lots of people that depend on the government for subsistence, India, China, Brazil. Brazil is a very closed economy. It's very hard to ship stuff into Brazil. The tariffs are incredibly high. And short run, those tariffs and the high taxes feed a lot of the people there.
So it's done to fuel social programs?
Right, and there's always there is a suspicion that, hey, those guys are, taking advantage of us. Those outsiders.
I think the president, it's beyond a suspicion. He's convinced we're getting taken.
Yeah, and are lives worse because the iPhone gets assembled in China? What would an iPhone cost if it was made in the old Apple facilities in Mountain View or San Jose or Milpitas? It would probably cost at least 50% more. And there's a lot of people think the iPhone costs too much already.
Right. It's up around $1,000 now.
Yeah, that's right. So I don't, while you'd be suspicious of it, and it would be great if those jobs that are being held by Chinese folks. It'd be great if those were in the U.S., but it doesn't really make sense economically. And in order to level the playing field, the cost to U.S. consumers and the cost to our economy is too high.
Okay, let's go to, I want to show you a video of Harley-Davidson. This is tape number 6. Harley-Davidson looking to shift its production of motorcycles to Europe because of cost of doing business and tariffs on their motorcycles. What do you make of that? That to me was kind of a clarion call that something's up. We've got to figure something out.
I don't think they're moving most of their manufacturing to Europe. They're only moving basically their European manufacturing, their European market manufacturing to Europe.
Was this a protest on the part of Harley-Davidson?
I don't
Were
think
they
so.
trying to send a message?
I think no, really, if you look at almost all companies that make stuff, and many of them are just brand owners and they don't actually manufacture things themselves, they contract that out. They manufacture stuff in many different locations. And, Harley's not shutting down their York, Pennsylvania facility, I don't think. And they've got some stuff in Milwaukee. But if they shipped motorcycles to Germany, if there is a trade war, and it looks like there may be, out of York, Pennsylvania, the costs are going to be too high. They're not going to sell any motorcycles. And ironically, Europe is a better market in many ways right now than the U.S. is for Harleys in terms of growth. I don't mean.
And even gas prices, it's more efficient for you to drive a motorcycle around than a car.
Right. So what companies generally do is they don't shut down all the plants in one location and start them up somewhere. That has happened. But you sort of hedge your bets, particularly if it's a time of great risk and uncertainty. And one of the things the Trump administration has certainly introduced is risk and uncertainty. What companies tend to like is stability. Tell me one way or the other, just tell me what it's going to be. And it's unclear. So it makes a lot of sense, particularly if you need to do long-term planning, and building a plant is a long-term thing.
So you better be ready in case the floor
need to hedge,
out.
right?
Quick question, Dale. If the companies are benefiting right now and the market is showing it, I suspect the earnings season that's coming up is going to be boffo for companies with the tax cut. That's been a positive. Are companies worried that they're going to give it right back with tariffs?
Yes. As we were talking before, we turned on the cameras here. I was at a company yesterday, a well-known, industry-leading firm, and they loved the tax cuts. It dramatically improved their profits.
Were they able to hire more, give raises, do all the stuff that was promised?
and do investments, and they're in a very high capital cost industry. But with the tariffs, what it looks like from a supply chain and finance view within this firm is that they're going to give back everything they made from the tax cuts. Now, we're not sure because we don't know exactly what's going to happen, but it's very unhappy to a lot of firms. If you look at where I grew up, there was an article on the front page of the New York Times today about the plants there, the supplier plants there are hurt really badly, and it's been an economy that in some ways in Michigan has been in decline for really 40 years in many ways, and starting to come back, and it looks like Detroit's better than it used to be. And these tariffs, particularly when you're kind of teetering a little bit, these tariffs go right to the heart and force a change in what the supply chain's going to look like.
We're going to take a break on Newsmaker Sunday. Dale Rogers, ASU Professor of Logistics and Supply Chain Management. When we come back, we've talked a little bit about the EU, China. What about our neighbors to the north and south, Canada and Mexico? We're going to talk about that in regard to tariffs and trade and what President Trump describes as us getting taken, jobbed. Back in a minute on Newsmaker Sunday. Back on Newsmaker Sunday, talking trade and tariffs. We're hearing a lot about it. So far, the market was reacting in a very choppy fashion when this all first kind of broke. And now it seems that the market has kind of baked some of this in. Dale Rogers is an ASU professor of logistics and supply chain management, a guy from Lansing, Michigan, who saw all this firsthand with the automotive industry. Do you think the president fundamentally understands what's going on with this? He obviously wants to appeal to the states in the industrial north, Michigan,
Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Illinois,
Is there
Ohio.
a chance he could actually hit a home run with this? I mean, it is so out of the box. Nobody was talking about this. He talked about it on the campaign trail. But like everything else, you don't know quite where he's at. Everything is an opening position in a negotiation.
It seems really unlikely to me. And while, again, businesses love the tax cuts, they don't like the uncertainty. You know,
Of
I
the
think
tariffs.
yeah. Or just uncertainty in regulation. You know, pick something and let's stay with it. They don't like inconsistency, volatility. It doesn't allow you to plan well for your business. And so I think it's really frightening to companies who are trying to plan, how am I going to get ready for the market in 2020 and 2025? Where do I put infrastructure? How do I manufacture products?
When you don't know what the
when the rules seem
tariff-
so up
yeah.
in the air.
Tell me about your friends in Michigan. You told me a very interesting anecdote. During the campaign, these are probably Democrats, right? That you grew up with.
Democrats.
And they voted for whom?
Had union jobs, you know, working in the plants, and didn't go to college. And they voted for Trump because those unionized jobs that used to be the big plants, you know, those are mostly gone. You know, isn't it interesting what's happened to unions? You're probably younger than me, but if you think about the 60s and the 70s and the real strength of unions
Oh yeah,
all
the
across the
UAW
country.
was a huge deal.
Right. And now the unions have mostly been shredded, and the unions that are powerful are the ones that are on the coasts, you know, managing the ports, because
And the public sector unions remain somewhat strong.
Depending on the state.
Right.
You know, if you're in Alabama or Arkansas, not nearly as strong as if you're in New Jersey or
Right,
New York.
right.
Yeah.
Okay, let's roll tape number 5. Canada, they're going back at us. U.S. steel products getting a 25% tariff. So they're putting tariffs on things like maple syrup and coffee and beans and strawberry jam and stuff. It's this, you know, kind of back and forth. The consumer is the one that loses in this, right?
Right. Well, not just the consumer, but workers. So here's one of the things that really makes me think that we haven't thought this through as well as we could have. Because if you look at the number of people that are in the steel and aluminum business, it's less than 1/10 of the number of workers that are using steel and aluminum to manufacture a product in the U.S. So we're going to protect the steel industry here. And there is some argument that it's strategic, but we're going to protect these smaller steel and aluminum companies while at the same time really hurting a number of workers that's more than 10 times more.
Who rely on steel
right,
from elsewhere,
who are making
or aluminum.
Yeah. And the truth is that these tariffs tremendously hurt American manufacturing, because almost all American manufacturers are using components and subassemblies from all over the place, some from the US, but all of a sudden the input costs into manufacturing something are going to be dramatically higher.
As we go to break, what do you think the president is angling for? What is it that he wants in the end?
Probably votes in Michigan and Wisconsin, I think. I mean, to anybody that understands the complex global economy and how stuff gets moved all around, these tariffs don't make sense to any of us, honestly. If you really know how things get made, it really doesn't make sense. And I don't know how many Chinese people will lose their job because of the tariffs, but there's going to be a lot of Americans that lose their jobs because of the tariffs.
Does it make sense to you, though, that stuff coming in from China, they flood our market, and when we send it over there, they slap us with these huge tariffs? The president's basically saying it's not even close to being a level playing field. We need some equity here.
I think the biggest issue is probably, I mean, where would you rather live, China or the U.S.? Which economy is better? I mean, I don't think it's a great argument to say they're winning. But he is right about the intellectual property issue.
No doubt.
Because
about that.
They're stealing stuff like crazy.
They are. And there's no checks on it.
Right.
Maybe that's what he's after.
And it's actually one of the costs of doing business in China is you have to transfer your technology. It's interesting. I was in
we got to get to break, so
okay.
go to we'll get back to it when we come back. Okay, we're back on Newsmaker Sunday, talking trade and tariffs. Dale Rogers, ASU professor of logistics, supply chain management. Back in a moment on Newsmaker Sunday.
Have you ever seen anything like this in terms of a trade war?
We haven't. This is unprecedented for a trade war in the 79 years that we've been in business.
That is Jeff Flock from Fox talking to farmers who are feeling the pinch right now with the tariffs going on. They're feeling it quickly. We're talking to Dale Rogers, ASU professor of logistics and supply chain management. Why is it that the dairy farmers and farmers, soybeans, they're feeling it first? Why?
Well, the inventory development and the sales cycle is so much shorter with farms because you got a crop in the field and you're going to sell it when that crop gets ripe. And so that's much more immediate than the manufacturing issues.
He said he hadn't seen anything like it in 79 years.
It is, there have been tariffs put on agricultural products before, but truthfully, because we're the place that's very efficient for agriculture. I mean, there's no place on the planet that's better at doing agriculture than us. Most countries have been pretty open to us because our inputs are so inexpensive.
And it's so good.
Right.
The quality's high.
Right.
Okay, we got a couple minutes left. I want to just get you looking into the crystal ball. Where do you think we're going with this trade tariff thing? It seems like we're playing, particularly with China, a game of chicken. The president's digging in and he's adding on. He's doubling down. He added 200 billion more on China, right, recently?
Right.
He's playing chicken with them, right?
Right, and it would be great if we can all back off and get some concessions from China.
Who will blink first, do you believe? It's hurting China more than us, right?
But China is somewhat immune to political stuff. Now, if all of a sudden there's riots in some towns in China, it may be different. But truthfully, that's so tightly controlled.
And
they can wait us out. And the American political divisions are so tough here that we usually don't last as long as
30 seconds. Do you believe that some of this with China and their reticence, that this involves North Korea now?
Well, honestly, I think that China has been using North Korea and some other states around to manufacture goods for them for a long time. And China's would be uncomfortable with a united Korea, I'm sure. And
10 seconds. Who wins in this?
I kind of think everybody loses. I think, if he pulls back and says, look, if you just do this, and they go along with it, but I think everybody loses on this.
Great to see you. Dale Rogers, ASU professor of logistics and supply chain management. Good to have you on Newsmaker Sunday. We'll see you next week.